I'm Jane McCallion.
And I'm Adam Shepherd.
And you're listening to the ITPro Podcast. And this week, we're all about that paper.
For years, businesses have been talking about ditching paper documents and workflows, taking advantage of digital technology to streamline their processes. But despite being a common fantasy for decades, for most organisations, it remains just that, a fantasy.
This week, we're taking a look at why the so-called paperless office is such a pervasive idea, the feasibility of getting rid of paper, and whether it's even a good idea in the first place.
So, Jane, you're probably one of the few people I know that still uses paper on a regular basis.
Well, you say that. So last time we saw each other, back in the days of February 2020, I used to use paper a lot more than I do now, actually. So the reason that I used to do it, I would print off features in my role as features editor and edit them on paper. Using red pen like some kind of teacher, and I'm sure that many of our listeners, possibly former colleagues, if you're listening, are starting to get flashbacks to primary school or working with me. But kind of full on edit it in paper, in pen on paper rather. But there was kind of two reasons for it. I guess the first was I did, and indeed still do, find it easier to see any errors and to kind of change my mind about where stuff should go, that kind of thing on actual paper than on a document like Word, Google Docs, whatever. But also for giving feedback, I've always found it much better to be able to sit down with somebody and go through what changes I've made and stuff if they're extensive. And that is an awful lot easier to do if the two of you can sit around a printed document than not. Now, obviously, I don't really see you guys anymore. So that part of it has largely gone out of the window. And the reality is actually that doing it in a doc is a lot quicker than it is doing it by hand. But I still got about 5 notepads on my desk upstairs, some of which have sort of reasonable, like, this is my planner, this is my book of meetings, and then there's one on there that's just like, I need to write something down just now. Here's a notebook that I occasionally share with my co-worker in my office, which is my husband.
Yeah, because you're a big fan of like bullet journaling and whatnot, aren't you?
Yes, I am. I have the coveted Lechterm 1917 notebook, dotted notebook. I haven't done a cover page for a couple of months because the beginning of the month just keeps creeping up on me. And I'm like, oh yeah, I didn't do a cover page for May, and now it's like the 14th of May. I guess it's a bit late. I'll try and remember for June. I find it easier to organize my thoughts that way, which I guess kind of plays into the way that I did edit on paper, or part of the reason why I used to do that. Kind of, it's not just that beyond work and beyond organizing my life, beyond that, our listeners obviously can't see this, but you can, which is I'm sat in front of a large bookcase, which is full of real actual books. And I still much prefer to use paper to, kind of read actual paper books. I'm looking across at my other bookcase over there, which is full of cookery books. Basically, there's a lot of paper in this house. Oh yeah, I'm extremely well read. I have read at least 5% of those books that are behind me. The rest are for decoration. So what about you, though? Like, kind of, you've always been, or I've always thought of you as like the opposite of me. I'm sat here, Grandma Jane, with all my piles of paper around me, like some kind of, I don't know, ancient journalist, whereas all the rest of you cool kids are all totally digital. So do you use paper much?
I hardly use paper at all. I have been pretty much entirely digital for a long time. Even when I was kind of at school and university, I would do the vast majority of my work digitally. And it's just, I find it, in kind of contrast to you, I find it much easier to organize my thoughts digitally compared to doing stuff on paper. Now that may be because I have absolutely atrocious handwriting, but it's just the way that I've kind of always preferred to work. So things like Google Docs and Google Drive and whatnot, as well as apps like Todoist and Evernote and all the rest of it, have been just a huge help with that.
Mm. Yeah, well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. So, sidebar, I'm pretty sure that I originally wrote out my dissertation by hand and then typed it up because that's the kind of cool person that I was and continue to be. But of course, yeah, without getting too into the weeds of journalistic skills here, I use shorthand and you
Mm,
don't.
no.
So that probably has an impact as well. Although I asked my mum, a secretary, whether she still uses shorthand, and she said she barely uses it at all anymore. So I continue
Mm.
to carry the flame of this ancient art of secretaries and journalists, which is shorthand.
So the paperless office has been, the concept has been around for years, if not decades.
Hmm.
But why would you want to have a paperless office in the first place? What are some of the kind of advantages that people are looking for when they talk about going paperless?
So I think there are loads actually. I think document management is a big one. It's a lot easier to find a document that you can just search for because it's a file in a database basically,
Mm,
than it is to go rifling through an actual kind of drop file cabinet looking for it.
mm.
And kind of I speak somewhat from experience of that as well. So and what you have. It's not kind of a surprise. If you need to do an audit of all the files and documents that you have, you don't have to literally go and fish everything out physically and go through it and try and make a decision about whether or not you need it, to try and figure out whether it actually is the age that you think it is, all of that kind of stuff, all of that really time consuming nonsense. That can
Mm,
all go if you get rid of paper. Um, yeah, there's also a cost benefit to being paperless. If you aren't printing, then you don't have to pay for the printer, you don't have to pay for the toner, you don't have to pay for the electricity for the printer, you don't have to pay for the paper. You don't have to pay
mm.
for the engineer to come out and fix the printer when it breaks on a roughly monthly basis. All this kind of stuff. um, or indeed special training for your staff so that they can fix the printer.
Mm. Yeah, I would argue that one of the biggest drives in kind of going paperless is just the ability to ditch printers, because I don't think there is a single more hated piece of technology in the entire world than printers.
I mean,
Printers are inherently evil and they can smell fear.
so like I have more than one printer at home. I have about 3.
Oh God.
Uh, well, they do different things. One of them sits on the table for no reason at all. And then we've got another one that is specifically for printing photos, and then the other one is
Okay.
just a document printer, which is upstairs, which is, kind of it's a pretty great printer, I'll be honest with you. It's like an office jet printer. And I'm slightly in love with it on the occasions where I have to print stuff out, which isn't loads, but it is occasional, which I'm sure we'll come back to.
We will
Um,
indeed.
but yes, and kind of the big office printers, I think because they've got so many moving parts, if you'll slightly excuse the pun, that they are more likely to go wrong and you're more likely to end up, kind of sobbing into the, paper feeder while you try to figure out what the hell is wrong. It's telling you it's got a paper jam, but there's no paper in there. You're like, please, please,
One step
sacrifice.
away from resorting to blood sacrifices.
Yes, sacrifice to the god of printers, or alternatively, just going and getting a blunt object, Fawlty Towers style.
It's that scene in Office Space, I think, that kind of most resonates. No, whether you've almost certainly seen a GIF of it at some point, where they take the office printer into a field and beat it to death with baseball bats, which I think is a universal bit of wish fulfillment for anyone who's worked in an office.
Yes, I think what we're saying here is possibly for the kind of mental health and tranquility of office workers. You need to get rid of printers. Yeah, so I think there's also actually just think about the size of a printer. Like an office
Mm,
printer, they are big. They take,
yep.
kind of about the size of a desk, really, or
Yeah.
like a usable amount of space. So that is something that if you don't have that, can be used for something else
Mm.
useful, like a table full of donuts.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And, you know, in an age where space is increasingly becoming a premium, it's, you know, it's a big allocation to give to something that kind of sits there and may or may not be used that frequently.
Oh,
There's
yeah.
also the environmental aspect, of course.
Mhm.
You know, less
Mhm.
printing means less paper used, which is, you know, inherently environmentally friendly, but also the energy used to print and the consumables and all of that kind of stuff. It's just better for the planet.
Yeah, but how am I supposed to do any recycling if you won't give me the paper to put in the recycling bin? That's how it works, yeah?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The more recycling you can do, the better.
Yeah. Recycle, reduce, reuse. That's the way it goes, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so going paperless has a number of kind of practical benefits in that area, but also the possibilities for data driven business that you can open up when you start using things like, you know,
Mm,
digital document management and, you know, digital storage and all of that kind of stuff are immense. You know, the more metadata you can assign to files and documents that would otherwise have been hard copy, it allows you to do a whole host of, you know, analytics type stuff on the
mhm,
back end in
mhm.
terms of tracking what kind of information you're processing most frequently, identifying trends within those documents, all kinds of kind of really, really clever stuff that you just can't do if it's just a, you know, flat sheet of paper.
Absolutely. Can't do big data analytics if, you haven't got your diversity of data, which means that you need stuff that would normally be on paper, emails,
Mm,
documents, that kind of thing. How are
yeah,
you gonna do it?
absolutely. Yeah, for an example of this, we actually spoke to NHS Bedfordshire about how they're cutting down kind of paper processes and
Mm,
using that digital information to unlock a huge amount of kind of data benefits from
mm,
that.
mm.
So why then, with, you know, all of the benefits that we've spoken about, do we not have kind of paperless offices by default? I mean, we've got the technology, you know, document scanners have existed for years, document management solutions, cloud based documents like Google Docs and, you know, Office Online and all that kind of stuff. It's been around and, you know, widely available for a long time. How come paper is still a thing at all?
One word, bureaucracy.
Mm,
This is the biggest driver, in my opinion, of why there are still printers in offices, why there is no paperless office, or they're rare if they exist, because sometimes you actually just need to fill out a piece of paper. You just need to fill out a form.
mm,
For whatever reason, I've had things where, for example, the formatting isn't quite right across different formats for something that it may not be a problem in like other situations, or I could just reply to somebody saying, "Oh yes, I'll have a cheese sandwich, please," rather than ticking a box. But sometimes it
mm,
is like a serious legal or official document, and the answer then is perhaps to print it out and fill it in or whatever and then scan it, or perhaps it might need to be sent by post for whatever reason, because
mm,
this is the other thing. You are playing by somebody else's bureaucracy as well. It's not just your choice. If your council says that actually you have to send them copies of your utility bills or whatever, and it has to
mm.
be by post, and they have to be in paper form, they can't be, kind of copies of scans,
Yeah.
then that's the way that it needs to be. And, kind of a lot of citizenship type stuff for other countries in particular. I am thinking of specifically of France because they love bureaucracy, and I tell you what, my experience has been they love paper as well. If this is something you need to fax, you better be ready to fax it. Um, but yeah, but kind of if you need to send off a birth certificate, quite often that will need to be like a birth certificate. It can't be a scan of it.
But it extends into the business world as well. There are a lot of, as you say, you know, bureaucratic and, you know, public sector government processes or legal and financial processes in some cases where, you know, they do require hard copies. They require things to be filled out and signed in paper and delivered on paper. It's a comparative minority these days, I think. More and more processes are becoming digital, particularly in the UK. But there are
Yeah.
still those kind of holdovers. And, that's why I joked earlier that printers can smell fear, because when you need a printer, 9 times out of 10, it's for something important and official. And when you need a printer for those kind of things, you really need it. You have to be really sure that you don't need that capability before you remove it entirely, especially in a business context. And the other factor, of course, is the expense. So, document management solutions are, for a kind of mid-sized business, probably going to be quite expensive to put in. You're looking at, not just the kind of the fees for whatever document management solution you're using and all of the kind of setup that entails, but also if you've been based on hard copies for any significant length of time, digitizing those existing records is going to take really quite an enormous
Mhm.
undertaking in terms of time, potentially expense, if you've got to, bring in a third party company to help crunch through it, which can make the process of fully digitizing, I guess, quite unattractive for some organizations.
Yeah, yeah, and of course, we spoke to Alison Davis from the Natural History Museum last year. We will leave a link to that podcast in the show notes for this episode, about how the Natural History Museum is digitizing itself, and of course, that's a massive undertaking. That's huge
Mm,
because it's been around for from 17 something, and it's a big deal, and there will be organizations that are that old, not just kind of centers of learning, but financial institutions that are several
hmm.
hundred years old. Um, you know, more than you think, actually, especially in Europe, that's been kicking around for a while. And yeah, that's going to be a huge undertaking. Even stuff that was set up in the 80s or 90s,
Yeah, that's
2000s.
like, I was going to say that's 20 years worth of documents, but it's really not. It's closer to
Oh,
40.
I was going to say, the 90s, you're an awful lot closer to 30 than you think, mate. Ha
Oh
ha.
God.
It's
But
coming
yeah,
for
that's
you.
oh God. But yeah, that's still like 40 years worth of documents, which,
Mhm,
if
mhm.
if you think about the amount of documents that flow through a business, even discounting the ephemeral stuff like reports and feedback forms and, planning documents and all of that kind of stuff, just looking at the important stuff like contracts and financial data and all of the stuff that you need to hang on to as a business for long
Mm.
periods of time, that stuff mounts up really, really quickly.
So quickly. So I worked for a small business, kind of in the late 2000s. And when I say small business, I mean like 5 employees, including me. And there was an entire downstairs room that was just full of documents. Now, some of it was like,
Wow.
yeah, old promotional material, but there were contracts. There was an emergency plan in there
Oh my
from
God.
when eco-terrorists were a big threat, because one of our clients was a pharmaceutical company that created pharmaceuticals for animals, but that was like a real concern back before I joined. They hadn't really been in existence for that long by the time I was
Mm.
there, like maybe 5 years, if that. And there were boxes and files everywhere. So that's just such a demonstration how even in the 2000s, which, oh God, that was 20 years ago. But no.
Oh no.
No, 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 this was late 2000s. So, 10 years ago, a little bit more. Um, that had already happened over the course of between, say, 2005 and 2009.
And of course, we have to remember that there are some people that prefer working on paper.
Mhm, mhm.
There are some people who are always going to gravitate to paper based processes because, particularly in creative fields, or even just within a business context, if they're doing, marketing plans or even like mind maps, there are always going to be people who don't entirely get on with digital documents as kind of
Yeah.
creative planning tools.
Yeah, I can't do it. I can't do a brainstorm in a document. It's just beyond the capabilities of my brain. I'm too visual.
I mean, it is worth remembering that for things like developers, for
Mm,
example, whiteboards are a common fixture in offices for exactly this reason.
yeah. And also when you're moving around, so when we used to do, commuting or travel or whatever, actually it's quite often more convenient to have some papers to work off, I have always found, than necessarily a laptop. For example, if the person in front of you decides to suddenly recline their chair, paper, if it folds or bends or whatever, it's not a problem. Your laptop, on the other hand, and,
Mm.
yes, I have nearly lost a laptop in exactly that situation. It was quite scary. Um, or if you're out and about and you don't, kind of taking a laptop or whatever with you isn't practical and you need to work on a document, then, if it's not sensitive particularly, just take it on a piece of paper. It can still be more convenient.
Yeah, that's a point that I feel like gets glossed over quite a lot. There are some cases, only a few in fairness, but there are some cases where paper is still more convenient than digital.
Yeah, yeah. Well, admittedly, yeah, my backpack did used to look like a catastrophe.
Yeah, but I suspect that was less to do with documents and more to do with just you.
Probably.
So, with this in mind, is it possible to achieve a paperless office ever?
That's a deep question.
Mm, asking the big questions on this podcast.
I'm yet to see anybody do it.
Yeah, and I think there's a reason for that. Even kind of the most forward thinking, digitally native, agile, lean startup still involves paper at some stages.
Mhm.
And I think that's a really good indication of how feasible it is to remove paper altogether. I think it is impossible to remove paper processes entirely. But on the other hand, I think what you can do is ensure that paper represents a very small stage of your document's life cycle. So if something comes in on paper, for example, a bank statement or, courier waybill or something like that, you can digitize that quickly.
Mhm.
Document scanners, as we mentioned, have been around for years and can be had without too much expense. You can digitize that quickly, you can get rid of the hard copy, and then move on with that digitally. Similarly, if you're doing some paper based planning, you can take the results of that, digitize it, get rid of the paper.
Yeah, and for, suppliers or contractors or whatever, it's equally possible to ask them, "Actually, could you send us this by email rather than,
Mm.
kind of by paper?" Some places will say, "Absolutely not." Some places will say, "Yes." Some places will do both.
Yeah, I feel like most suppliers and organizations are now coming around to the idea of paperless communication and paperless billing for exactly the same reason that, everyone else is looking at paperless processes, for all of the reasons we've already talked about. It's as much an advantage for them as it is an advantage for the recipients of that paper.
Indeed. And if you want to create maybe not a paperless office, but achieve to go as low paper as possible,
Mm. Paper
then
light,
yes.
diet paper.
No,
I can't
that's
believe it's not paper.
many terrible things have just popped into my head. People of a certain generation who went to junior school will know what I mean, I'm sure. But bringing your conversation out of the toilet, um, no, you can reduce the opportunity to print. Like, kind of not just be like, oh, think, do you really need to print this? But actively make it inconvenient for people to print so that they will only do it if they need to. So rather than having a printer on every floor or by every bank desks, have one every two floors or just a couple in the basement. And then kind of human nature to just be like super lazy.
Mm.
The path of least resistance will win. And so if it's not something that really actually needs to be printed out, people probably won't.
Yeah, I think going back to the traditional kind of concept of having a print room in an
Mm,
office could actually be a huge driver for, a paper light, quote unquote, office. Yeah, as you say, essentially putting up as many barriers to physically printing as possible, much like the idea of having kind of congestion zones
mm,
for cars to try and encourage people away from driving and onto public transport and whatnot. Throwing up those kind of barriers can be useful. And also, going back to what we were saying about data driven business, look at the amount that your printers are being used. You might have a printer on every floor. Are there some floors where the printer is in, pretty regular use? Are there floors where the printer is used like in every other week?
mm, mm. Yeah, and just remove it from the places that aren't needed, but also take into account, for example, if your finance or HR department may only use their printer, kind of once a month, but that's because it's payroll, you
Mm.
probably shouldn't take their printer away. So after doing your data investigation, do double check with the departments involved as to why there's
Mm.
like a certain pattern.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, it can give insights into other areas for investment. You bring up payroll. If your finance department is using their printer a hell of a lot at the end of the month when payroll comes along, is that because the digital tools that they have for managing payroll aren't as convenient as doing it all on paper? Is there anything you can do to make that process easier? Can you
Mm.
invest in more training, more digital tools? Of which there are countless multitudes, to make that an easier process. So, Jane, with everything that we've spoken about today, what's going to happen to your three printers? Are they destined for the scrap heap, or does printing still have a place in your life?
Are they hell? I'm actually, I'm
I'm going to buy
usually for now.
5 more printers.
Yeah. I've just opened this cupboard behind me, and oh look, it's full of printers. So no, the printers that we have are staying, uh, and in fact, I'm going to be printing out some documents to take out with me tomorrow because I'm out and about for part of tomorrow, and I can't edit on my phone. I'm sure there are some people who do or try or whatever, but I am not a masochist, so I'm just going to print out using my fancy printer. No, basically, you can take my printer from my cold dead hands.
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for this week. You can find links to all of the topics we've spoken about today in the show notes and even more on our website, itpro.co.uk.
You can also follow us on Twitter at ITPro, as well as Facebook and LinkedIn. And don't forget to subscribe to the ITPro podcast wherever you find podcasts. And if you can, leave us a rating and review.
We'll be back next week with more analysis from the world of IT. Thanks for listening.
Bye.
The ITPro Podcast is brought to you by the Dennis Podcast Network.